Hello, and welcome to the 2022 Ohio Anna Book Festival. I'm Bill Eichenberger. Pleased to welcome you to the Buckeye True Crime panel. We'd like to thank our festival sponsors and partners, all of whom you can find listed on the Ohio Anna website. And thanks to our booksellers, the Book Law, Chairman Bill. You can get copies of all the books festival by going online to bookloft.com. And then now I'm pleased to introduce the authors. I'm just going to toggle between my screen here. Okay, so Thomas Crowl is an avocational historian who has published two previous books before the book he's going to talk about today, Murder of a Journalist and Opdyke's Tigers in the Civil War. His articles have appeared in Timeline, Echoes, History Magazine, and the Central States Archaeological Journal. Mark Sebastian Jordan has been an active presence in the Ohio art scene for over 30 years as a writer, actor, director, playwright, and improv comedian. His Malabar trilogy of historical dramas was featured in sellout performances for a decade at Malabar State Farm. He has been featured in television programs such as Ghost Hunters, Mysteries at the Museum, My Ghost Story, House of the Unknown, and he's also, and this is an interesting little tidbit, was an extra in the Shawshank Redemption. So a little celebrity today. Wendy Coyle is a lifelong resident of Ohio. In 2012, she published her first book, Geneva on the Lake, a history of Ohio's first summer resort. And when not writing or traveling, Coyle teaches at Zane State College. She also founded her own treasure hunting club, First Class Gals. So let's go in alphabetical order, I guess. Tell us who you are and the book, and then tell us a thumbnail about the book that we're going to discuss today, the book that you've written. So Thomas, why don't we start with you?
Yes, hello, I'm Tom Crowl, and my book is Queen of the Con, From a Spiritualist to the Carnegie Imposter, which is the true story of Cassie Chadwick, who at the beginning of the 20th century managed to borrow millions of dollars by claiming to be Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. This was only the pinnacle of her career, which she was a career criminal, and it included forgery, prostitution, bank fraud, and any number of things that she could do to make a few dollars. She was certainly an extraordinary woman, and as far as imposters go, Time magazine listed her as 8th of their top 10. I believe she was the only woman. She's certainly an interesting individual.
She certainly is, and I can't wait to hear and learn a little bit more about her today. Let's see, who's up next? I believe that would be Mr. Jordan. Why don't you take us away?
Hi, I'm Mark Sebastian Jordan, and my book is The Sealy Rose Murders at Malabar Farm, which you can see right here over my shoulder. If you've ever been to Malabar Farm State Park, you may have heard about Sealy. She's famous in folklore. Louis Bromfield, the Pulitzer Prize winning author who started Malabar Farm, wrote about her in one of her books. So her story spread worldwide and remains a very, very interesting, fascinating story. But no one had ever written a real book of record going in depth about this case. So I decided to do that. And it's a story about a disturbed young woman who poisoned her entire family. She also attempted to poison additional people. She actually poisoned her mother twice in 2 separate incidents to kill her, which by definition makes her a serial killer. But the thing that's so fascinating about this case is it's also strongly probable from the surviving information we have that Sealy Rose was developmentally disabled. So we have the extraordinary case of a developmentally disabled person who also happened to be a psychopath. And delving into the details of that story has been a passion of mine for many years. I wrote a play about it, and I've traveled around the state telling the story. And so writing the book was the next logical step to gather all of this research and information.
Guess how about we call it the culmination?
Yeah.
Wendy Coyle, take it away.
Sure. My name is Wendy Coyle, and the book that I am going to present on today is Lake Erie Murder and Mayhem. And it is a collection of several stories of crimes that occurred on the lake or right beside the lake. So the criteria to keep this from being an overwhelming project, because if you think of all the cities along the lake and even into Canada, there's lots of cities. So to narrow that down, the crime had to happen out on the lake or right on the lake shore. And then that helped this project be a little more manageable for me. And as I was writing, what I found out is the lake provides a perfect backdrop for some good crime. And so it covers everything from crime on a luxury cruise ship, all the way to a bank robbery where they used the lake to escape. And then there's some drama that happened out on the islands as well. So this was my pandemic project, and everybody said, well, that sounds like an uplifting project to work on over the pandemic. But the pandemic did give me time to actually finish the project, and I'm happy with how it turned out.
Yes, us history lovers, we are fond of things that maybe that other people are not fond of, and that could be murder and mayhem.
Right.
I guess I was going to ask how each of you chose your subject. Wendy, you kind of addressed that, but can you just go a little bit more in detail about how you chose your subject?
Sure. So my first book, Geneva on the Lake, which is Geneva on the Lake's a little town right up on Lake Erie. That's what I chose to write. And then from there, it kind of just made sense to keep writing books that occurred on the lake shore near the lake, because when I do book events, I'm usually up north. And also there's so much history there. I'm just so fascinated by it. So as I was writing my first 3 books, I kept gathering these other little stories of like crimes that occurred on the lake. I'm like, oh, this might make a good article, or maybe another book down the road. So by the time I got to the 4th book, I had like files worth of stories that I wanted to cover. And so yeah, that's how that one kind of emerged. And then also our publisher has different series. So there is a Murder and Mayhem series, and my editor's like, I think this would fit right in there. So that is how that book emerged.
Serendipity. That's great. I'm wondering, well, never mind. Let's go on, and I'll come back. I'll circle back to that. Thomas, why don't you tell us how you chose your subject? You've done Civil War history and true crime. How did you hone in on this true crime story that you tell?
Well, I also maintain a file when I'm researching or reading something and I find an interesting story, something that looks like it would be maybe even a book or an article. Why I make a note of it or copy it or something and put it into a file that I keep. The file's getting pretty thick because there's a lot of good stories out there for sure. But in the case of Cassie Chadwick, I was researching, I believe, my first book, and I stumbled across her. And then I have a process. I not just look at the individual and what might be a good story, but from there, I'll look and see what's been written, do Google searches, look online, look at the used booksellers, that sort of thing, and see what might be out there, because you don't necessarily want to write a book if you can avoid it, if somebody's writing one at the same time on the same subject. So what I've done is do that research, and if it looks as though no one has done anything, and in the case of Cassie Chadwick, that's the situation, that no one had done anything that was nonfiction. All of her previous books had been what I would label historical fiction. So I love the story. Once the deeper I've gotten into it, why the more interesting it's become, and found that she is was quite an extraordinary individual, and was certainly someone deserving of at least one book.
Excellent. And then Mark, same question.
Well, I first heard about the story of Sealy Rose when I was 12 years old. It's very well known in the north central Ohio region. And of course, I kept getting in touch with it, visiting Malabar over the years. And I just kept getting more and more involved with the story, and eventually wrote the play about it. So it's just been the kind of fascination that kept me coming back to it. But the book actually emerged from when my publisher found my local history column. I write a column for knoxpages.com and select stories from local history. And the publisher found me and said, would you be interested in gathering some of your columns together, or perhaps writing another book on a historical subject? And I said, yes, but if you're looking for a book, boy, do I have a story that we should start with. And that was the Sealy Rose case.
Yeah, that's terrific. There's a type of program that makes me pull out my hair on television, and that's the murder mysteries that you get to the very end, and then they say, yeah, we don't really know who did it. I'm wondering, though, for you three authors, Tom, I'm thinking of Cassie and how many conflicting stories there were, and how hard it is to know just precisely what happened. How do you walk that line?
Well, that's difficult, and especially difficult in a case like Cassie Chadwick, because she was a con artist and she spent her entire life dissembling and creating new personas and abandoning them. I did want to make the book as factual as possible, so there was a lot of material and a lot of stories which just didn't make the cut, to be honest. But the ones that were there, I was usually able to verify 2 or 3 times, or find some sort of way to back it up. And it was not easy. She also was unique, I think, in the criminal world in some respects, in that she never testified in her own defense. She never confessed. She never told anybody publicly that what she had actually done or why she did it. She was incredibly tight-lipped and went to her grave that way. So there is no autobiography. There was nothing that you could, it just had to be compiling what reporters and other individuals had to say about her or thought about her. And it took a long time to straighten all this out and parse it all out. But I think I have the story pretty correct in the book. And certainly there's a lot of other things out there. And I would agree with the federal and state prosecutors who did prosecute her at the time. And they said that 90% of what they had learned and what they knew would never be made public.
Right. Mark, I'm wondering with what you thought, what you said, developmentally disabled. Are you comfortable with that? Can we really know? Even the language changes over time.
The language changes enormously. And that's one of the things that I talk about in the book. I mean, you look today at some of the terms they used back then. During Sealy Rose's trial, they were at each other's throats trying to define what her mental state was in the terms of the day. So they're using words like, imbecile, moron, pervert, all kinds of
Right.
things that are just reprehensible. It is not possible to know in the sense of a modern diagnosis for sure, but it does seem that it is very likely that there was some sort of impairment that she had mentally, though it was not extremely severe. And obviously she was very capable of being quite cunning to plan and execute murders.
Right. And then Wendy, I'm wondering, since you told several different stories, how you found finding historical records that you knew you could rely on.
Sure. So with two of my stories, I was lucky in the sense that the FBI got involved, which I was surprised at first. I'm like, why is the FBI involved in this story that happened on Lake Erie? Well, any story, any like murder or crime out on the Great Lakes or the oceans considered a crime of the high seas. So then the FBI stepped in. And with that, with the Freedom of Information Act, now you can go onto the FBI website and you can request some of that information, and it's all digitized now. So with my first story, I'm like, I'm going to try this out. So I gave all the information I could on the crime, and like a week later, I had a 200-page document on that FBI's investigation. I mean, word for word, everybody they talked to. It was amazing as somebody that does a lot of research, like to have that in my hand. And then also, if any of the stories where they went to court, you can sometimes you're lucky and you can find court records. And then a couple of them, they were just written in the local history of the town. Like I remember there was a small town up in Canada, and they had recorded that history of this crime, and it was like right after it happened. So it was pretty close on, and then I'm sure the other panelists know the newspapers, that's a good starting point, but you can't always rely on everything. But sometimes you can get a pretty good timeline of like when things are happening. So I usually start there and then I dig into those other items if I'm lucky enough to find them.
Right. Yeah. The newspapers you kind of have to verify, or you have to have a certain lens, right? I mean, because papers aren't the same now as, well, there are barely any left, but they're not the same as they used to be. And, sensational, stories, and, they think in the modern times that the Sam Shepard case is one of those cases where he was tried and convicted in the press. And so I'm wondering, like, how do you kind of sort through, these stories that you see might be a little sensational, and then find out what's actually true?
So like I said, I use that as a timeline, just like, okay, this was reported on Tuesday, then this happened on a Friday, and I'm building a timeline. And then I just go in and I try to verify anything that is that they wrote about. And then also I like the newspapers because sometimes they'll mention another name of somebody involved, and then I can go in and research that person, or maybe they'll say it happened in this particular location. Well, then I have that information. But it's a lot of verifying and just taking it all with a grain of salt. Like, okay, this happened, but once I see the opinions coming in, then I have to sort those out as well. I don't know if anybody else has a better method. It's sometimes confusing.
Yeah.
Well, as far as newspapers go, I would have to say that you can create a timeline, but even that can be difficult because in the large cities, the newspapers often published several editions during the day. And you could, one, and you never know exactly where they're cutting it off. For example, if you're looking at a trial that's ongoing, the trial might run till 5 o'clock in the afternoon, but the newspaper has a deadline for an edition at 3. And so, it ends there, and then the rest of the day is in the next day, and you've got to try to sort all that out. And I'm sure my co-authors or other authors here would agree that it can be very frustrating trying to put it all together into a really firm timeline.
Right. And then Mark, how much did you rely on newspapers of the day?
Well, I agree. They're a great starting point. You have to cross-reference and verify things because there are exaggerations, sometimes just outright mistakes. But boy, sometimes you find some great little nuggets. One that immediately pops to mind is one of the officials involved in researching the Sealy Rose case. A reporter asked him if he thought that Sealy Rose was mentally slow, and it was the county coroner he was talking to, the Richland County coroner. And it just shows that that officials weren't media savvy back in the 1890s, because he very unguardedly replied, well, I think the whole family was pretty slow, which nobody would say anything like that today. What a great little nugget. It gives you just a little true burst of someone's opinion that managed to get through all the distractions and filters. So you can find great things in the newspaper stuff, but you always have to dig deeper, which was especially challenging in this case because the Rose family came from Southern Ohio originally in Pike County, and they came from the western part of Pike County. You dig into the old records of Pike County, and you find that there were some records in the eastern half of the county where the county seat Waverly was. The western half of the county was just this kind of wild backlands area. There's very few surviving records at all.
I agree with, I think Mark makes a good point here that even though there might be multiple newspapers that cover a particular topic, and if it's a major story, it might even be nationwide, sometimes you find the most interesting tidbits in newspapers that are 500 miles away from the scene of the crime. And so you really have to expand your search sometimes.
Absolutely. Tom, can you walk us through who Cassie was and some of the highlights or what she did? I mean, we really haven't gotten into the nuts and bolts of it without giving away, obviously, your whole book. Well,
yes, right. Well, she started out, she was just a teenager when she started in the world of crime, and she never varied from that path, even having spent time in the Ohio Penitentiary for forgery and passing forged promissory notes. I suppose I should back up here. In this day and age, we don't use promissory notes, personal promissory notes, the way they were used in the 19th century. But at that particular point in time, anybody who was even modestly wealthy or had some property or whatever, a lot of times your income wasn't on a steady stream. So if you needed cash, you could write out a personal promissory note and say, I'll pay you so much money on such a date and so much interest, and they would give it somebody, they would give you the money in return. You could even buy the blank notes in any good stationery store across the nation in those days. And so as you can imagine, these were also prime places to commit fraud because there was no notary public on the thing. There was no recording of it. So anybody could essentially sign it and do it. And so what Cassie Chadwick was best at was forging these promissory notes and then passing them or using them, passing them for cash or using them for collateral to borrow money. Now, originally, she went to prison in Ohio in 1890 for having passed the promissory notes. So she wised up, and the second time around, she decided that she would not pass them, but she would only use them as collateral for loans. which is what she did. And she was very audacious and tended to think big. And so when she began her career as Cassie Chadwick in the late 1890s, she decided Andrew Carnegie would be the perfect person. Now, she lived in Cleveland, and John D. Rockefeller had lived in Cleveland. So there were a lot of people who knew him and were familiar with a lot of things about him. So she bypassed Rockefeller and went to Carnegie, who was probably the second wealthiest man in America in 1900, or shortly thereafter when he finally sold his steel holdings. And so she used these notes to borrow money. She borrowed money privately from different individuals, and she borrowed money from banks. Now, I want to say right up front, she didn't swindle every person who loaned her money. She paid a lot of it back. Mm-hmm. And she paid huge fees and commissions to get this money. Sometimes 25% of the loan would be a commission to some lawyer for arranging it. So, and I mean, we're talking about days when $25,000 was a lot of money. And that's what these guys were getting to get her a loan for a few months. She borrowed money from Oberlin College. They loaned her money not once after they got wise, but twice. And so she did pay Oberlin College back remarkably. One of the places she didn't pay back was a small national bank in Oberlin. And she managed to convince those fellows, the cashier and the president, to loan her pretty much all the money the bank had, all of its deposits, all of its reserves, all of everything, over $200,000 in cash she got. And they loaned it to her because of her Carnegie connection. Primarily, she used that as collateral. And when that bank collapsed, which ultimately it was going to, and it collapsed because another lender of hers in Boston wasn't paid on time, then her house of cards began to fall apart. And at that point, people started thinking about trying her and arresting her and so forth. And the federal government trumped the state government, and so they tried her. They charged her with bank conspiracy to defraud a national bank. Now, in all honesty, and in Cassie's defense, I will say that this was a very shaky thing to try her on, because they really didn't have good proof of conspiracy. And there was the argument at the time that conspiracy requires multiple people, and she was being tried by herself. The bank president had actually died from the stress of having to deal with this, and it was only her and the cashier. So she was tried, though, nonetheless. I think she was largely convicted because she had caused a lot of suffering in Oberlin. Because the bank collapsed, a lot of people lost money. A lot of those people were students at Oberlin College and small farmers and businessmen and so forth. And I think the jury, which was composed primarily of farmers and tradesmen, they could understand borrowing more money and money that you couldn't pay back, and they didn't understand all the arcane issues of bank operations and fraud. So they simply convicted her, and I think she certainly probably deserved it. Now, I will say this about Andrew Carnegie, that he was actually called to testify. He spent one half of the day sitting in the courtroom the first day of the trial. That nobody really thought that she was Carnegie's illegitimate daughter, but there were so many similarities. She knew so many details about Carnegie that there were a lot of people that felt that somehow, some way, she had some connection to him. And to make matters more interesting, after she was convicted, when she was tried or first charged before she was convicted, but Carnegie didn't want anybody to suffer because of the bad use of his name. So he made all of those small depositors in Oberlin whole. He made sure they got all their money back. He didn't pay the big depositors or the public institutions like the school system or the township, but he did pay for the small depositors. And to sweeten the pot, he threw in a Carnegie Library for Oberlin. He actually gave them somewhere around $100,000, which was considerably more than he usually gave for a Carnegie Library. At that time, his average was like $20,000 or $30,000. So that's a sort of a thumbnail sketch of what she did and how she did it. I would say that even after she died, people continued to look for the money because the consensus generally was that she did not spend and they could not account for all of the money. And her very loyal son in his early 20s, his name was Emil, he came and saw her in prison. He was working in Cleveland when she died. After she was gone and buried in Canada, Emil disappeared. Nobody knows where he went, what happened to him, not been able to trace him. So if you want to look for lost money, you could certainly spend some time trying to chase down Cassie Chadwick's son.
Yeah, I'm envisioning a beach chair and a daiquiri and and her son just kicking back with his mother's money.
Well, as you know, they called her the Duchess of Diamonds because she loved jewelry and diamonds. And I don't think there's much doubt but what she didn't squirrel some of this away to ensure that he had a very soft life for the rest of his days.
Well, Wendy, I suppose it's akin to asking you to tell me who your favorite, to asking someone who their favorite child is. But you've got several different stories in your book, and I'm wondering, is there one story in particular you'd like to sort of dive into and give us some of the details?
Sure. So the one that comes to mind is actually the first chapter. And Bill, it's one of those that didn't have a conclusion because it wasn't solved. So there won't be a spoiler alert because I don't know who did it. I have some thoughts. But one of the reasons that it's my favorite, if I'm going to have a favorite murder story, is that it occurred on one of the early cruise ships that would cruise the Great Lakes. And a lot of people, when I'm talking about the book at presentations, they don't realize how many of those huge luxury ships sailed. And the one that I'm talking about was called the CMB. And it was one of the few that you could stay overnight on. So they had like the ballrooms, the saloons, the restaurants, the open air decks. I mean, it was a beautiful ship. So the setting there really appealed to me. And so in that chapter too, I included a lot of pictures of the ship, which I feel like readers appreciate that. But anyway, a woman in 1940, her name was Noreen Mosey, was traveling, and she actually came from Alaska, and she was visiting relatives in Cleveland, and then she was going to hop on this ship, stay overnight, and go to Buffalo, and then visit family on the East Coast. Well, over the night, she disappeared off the ship. And what is really strange is that when the ship docked in Buffalo, so she didn't get off, of course, but her luggage stayed in the room, and there was actually like her dress was laid out on the bed as if that she was planning to wear that the next day. But the ship continued to go back and forth several times, and this luggage is just lying there back and forth, and nobody reported it for 2 weeks. So there's a whole big, confusion of why this wasn't reported. Was it a cover up? How did they not notice that? And I go into details of like what their excuse was of why they didn't report a missing passenger. Eventually, though, they did report her, and as I said, the FBI jumped right in because it was considered crime of the high seas. And while they're trying to figure this out, a body washes up on Geneva on the lake, which just happens to be another book, I wrote about Geneva on the lake. I'm like, oh, that's so strange. And of course, it was this missing passenger. And she had washed up on shore like 2 days after her disappearance, but well, they didn't know who she was at Geneva on the lake. So they just kind of took like a picture of her face and then went ahead and buried her. So anyhow, the whole story is that the FBI investigated and they talked to over 200 passengers, and this was never solved. But one of the clues that makes me think that it most likely was a murder, when they did it, they had to remove her from Geneva Cemetery and take her to Cleveland, where they did a thorough autopsy, and they found that she had been blunt force trauma to the back of the head that she would have suffered like an hour before her death. And then the biggest clue for me is that they said under her fingernails there was like this greasy substance, and when they tested it, and it went into all the science of how they tested this, even back in those days, it matched the substance that would have been found on the railing of the ship, like maybe she was holding on to it. And then like her jewelry was missing. So I don't know how, like if you fell overboard, you'd throw off all your jewelry in the process. So there was a lot of clues there. And then there were some characters on the ship. There was a guy that had been hitting on another woman, and she turned him down. And so he threw himself on the deck chair and slept out on the deck. And we know that this passenger Marine had been up on the deck in the late nighttime because she'd left a note to her son that she was going to post the next day saying it was so hot I had to go up to I went up to the deck, so I'm going to go up to the deck and get some air. So anyway, there were just so many interesting clues there. But then they, after like 2 months of the investigation, they still wrote it as accidental. But I don't know. Every time I tell the story or look at that investigation, I'm like, I don't know. And the family was never happy with that, ruling as well. So I guess that it happened on a cruise ship, and there's, like Hugo, I really like a mystery. I kind of like I used to love unsolved mysteries on TV, and there's a show called Disappeared that I watch on the Crime Channel. To me, because there's so many possibilities and the what ifs, and I know like other people, they're like, that drives me crazy, I have to know, but I like that kind of story. So yeah, so that was probably my favorite of the book.
Right, great. Now Mark, tell me about Seeley. It's murders with an S. So walk us through her whole career in murdering her family.
Well, she was, as I mentioned, she was known to be a slow child. She was, quite a ways behind other children in school. Actually, the family kept sending her to school until she was 20 years old, at which point one of the teachers came down to the family and said, stop sending her. She's never going to learn more. She got, I believe one of her teachers estimated during her trial that she never got much above the mental level of a first grader. But she, more than anything else, she was known to be flighty and giggly. The kids of the valley where she lived actually nicknamed her Silly Rose because of her flightiness. But she showed moments of real temper and anger, getting mad, and that someone would try to discipline her and she would fight back. And what ended up setting her off on the path she went on was that she fell in love with a boy who lived next door. Now, by this time, she was in her early 20s, and the boy she fell in love with was only 16 years old. But to her, she kind of looked up to him. And she had crushes on other young men in the valley, and people had either just ignored her or laughed in her face. Well, the 16-year-old who lived next door, his name was Guy Barry, and he felt a little sorry for Seeley. So instead of treating her badly, he just tried to be nice to her, let her down easy. But unfortunately, she took that to mean that he actually was receptive to her interest. And so before long, she was going around saying that they were going to be getting married, starting a family, and all this. And Guy Barry's father came over to speak Ceilie's parents and said, "Get your daughter under control. There's no way my son would ever be marrying a girl like that." And so that caused a lot of arguing in the family. They told her to forget about Guy, to stop obsessing over him. And she appeared to do what she was told. But what she actually did was she started secretly brooding about that. And along about that time, she heard her parents discussing a murder case in the newspaper, which is another book I hope to write about sometime. It's a little known case involving a farm worker in Summit County, Ohio, who allegedly bludgeoned to death a farmer and his wife so that he could run away with the farmer's daughter. So this gave her the idea of removing obstacles to run off with a lover. And she was just cunning enough to take that piece of information and combine it with another piece of information, which her family had always told her: don't mess with the Rough on Rats brand rat poison, because even just a pinch of that stuff could kill a person. So whatever you do, you don't ever touch that stuff. Well, she put those two pieces of information together, came up with a plan, and put it in motion.
And then how long did it take for her to poison? Was it like just one meal and then they were?
She poisoned her father, mother, and brother at breakfast in late June of 1896. The father died within a day or two. The brother died a week later. The mother started to recover, and since the investigating sheriff could not find any evidence, could not get Ceilie to confess to the case, he backed off and let Ceilie take care of her mother, which she did for a month. Meanwhile, she attempted to poison the parents of the guy she was in love with, the parents next door. She attempted to poison the pastor of the church down the road that they went to. And when the doctor finally told Ceilie's mother that she'd be recovering, that's when Ceilie murdered her with a second dose of poison, at which point there was such a public uproar that the authorities figured they'd better find a way to remove Ceilie from society. And they finally got one of her few friends to get the confession out of her while they had a witness standing by in hiding to write it all down.
What was she eventually sentenced to? Did they take into consideration her mental state?
They did. That was a big element of the trial. And she was ultimately found, and I think rightly found, not guilty by reason of insanity, and spent the rest of her life in the state hospital system. I should say, ostensibly spent the rest of her life in the state hospital system. There is some evidence that she may have been mistakenly released for a short period of time, which is one of the things that I held back until the later part of the book. Because with writing the Ceilie Rose case, it's well known that she did these crimes, she confessed to it. So everyone knows how it ends before they even start the book. But I saved a few bombshells for later in it, including this information which we turned up in the research phase, that she apparently was released for a while after she had only been in the state hospital for about a year or so. She was apparently released to some of her family from Southern Ohio. But when word got back to Richland County about that, they pointed out she's a ward of the state, and she actually is not supposed to be released. And so they made sure that she was quietly put back into the asylum.
That's so interesting. Tom, that one of the stories I've heard about Cassie is that she had someone from Cleveland with her and did a horse and carriage and stopped in front of the Carnegie's home in New York City. Is that apocryphal, or is that? Tell me a little bit about that story, because I think it's so cool.
Well, there are multiple versions of that story, and I did use it in my introduction. Certainly it captures the essence of the woman and what she was capable of doing. Whether it's completely true or not, I'm afraid I can't really say. I couldn't really verify that. Essentially, what the story amounts to is that she took, most agree, a lawyer from somewhere, perhaps New York, perhaps Cleveland. In New York City, she asked him if he wanted to come with her when she went to visit Andrew Carnegie. And well, who's going to refuse that? So she and the lawyer take a carriage up Fifth Avenue to Carnegie's mansion, which covers almost an entire block in New York City. And she tells the lawyer to please wait in the carriage, and she'll go check and see if Mr. Carnegie is in for visitors, which in those days you could be home, but not in for visitors, not want to see anybody. So she went up, walked boldly up to the front door, raps on the door, butler opens it, and she tells the butler some story and disappears inside. And the lawyer witnesses all this, of course. Once she's inside, however, she doesn't ask to see Carnegie. She wants to see the housekeeper, and she tells the housekeeper that she wants to hire somebody that used to work for them. And so they talk for like 20 minutes. The housekeeper's getting a little tired of this woman who doesn't know who she is. And so at that point, Cassie bids them farewell, walks out the door, waves and chirps happily at everybody. And she goes down to the carriage and tells the lawyer that, boy, she's really sorry, but Mr. Carnegie's not seeing visitors today. But then she said, I'd like to tell you a little secret, but you have to keep it a secret. And about the time she does this, a package falls out of her purse. And she says that Carnegie is her father, her true father. And the package contains U.S. Steel bonds that he had given her to help fund her life. And the lawyer is just, dumbfounded by this. But as they turn the carriage around and head back downtown, he looks over his shoulder and he thinks he sees a small, short, bearded man in a gray suit standing in the window upstairs. Of course, that would have been Andrew Carnegie. The story is probably, as I said, an excellent example, and that's why I use it, of what she was capable of. In her prime, she could easily pull something like this off, and she was a superb actress, extremely persuasive, terribly audacious, and this was certainly her kind of thing. Whether it actually happened that way or not, there's a lot of other stories I could tell you and that are in the book about things that she did, but she had to be an extremely intelligent individual to keep all this information, all these details. And she wasn't just running one con at a time. She would be playing bank floats on deposits in New York and Cleveland, and she'd be playing the stock market and going to bucket shops where they did like day trading. She did all this and kept this all straight in her head at the same time. And even though she might have been, a lot of people thought she might have been insane, I don't think she was. I think she was just extremely intelligent and very capable.
Mm-hmm.
Wendy, you had me at a pirate, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little about the pirate story. And I didn't realize there were pirates on Lake Erie.
Yeah, so there were several what are considered pirates. And the one that I wrote about, what is most interesting about him is he actually, he murdered people. He murdered, I think, 2 or 3 women on land. And while he was out on a ship, he attempted to murder another person. But the thing that the papers focused on, and even the law, was that before he tried to murder her, he had swiped her rings and some jewelry in the room. And that's what made him a pirate. And so he actually was convicted of piracy. And like the whole attempted murder was like a secondary crime. So the ones on land he'd already had been acquitted of. And then the second one, when he was out on the lake, then They were just more concerned that he took those rings and that's considered piracy. He was out on the water. And so that's what he was imprisoned for. And he was considered like a modern day pirate because it happened, I believe, in the 40s, and probably one of the last ones on the Great Lakes ever convicted. But his story is really interesting too, when you get into like the psychology of like, there was so much undiagnosed mental illness there. Even when he was a child, when he was 12, he tried to strangle a girl on the playground or something like that. And then they just sent him to like a boys reform school, and they didn't know what to do. So I kind of focused in on, how much of that was just undiagnosed mental illness and no kind of treatment. And he just went on and kept committing the same type of crime until he got busted for piracy. So yeah, and he's on the front cover. He's the one right in the middle. If you've seen my book, he's kind of looks like a mean guy, but
that's so interesting. All right, before we close up, I always ask the panel this question, and that is, and I'll start with you, Mark. What do you want people to know about your book that we haven't discussed yet?
Well, that's a good question. I think what I want people to know about this book is that it is not an attempt to sensationally tell a story about a crime for, reasons of titillation or entertainment. Rather, it's an in-depth examination of a community, a society where there was a person who lagged behind other people in development, and in a certain way. I mean, yes, there are, of course, issues of personal responsibility, but in a certain way, this whole story, the Sealy Rose murders, happened because we have an individual that no one really engaged with as a human being. She wasn't taken seriously. She wasn't regarded as a full person, full human. And so no one really engaged with her in a way that could have allowed her to really develop her life, limited though her development was, never allowed her to develop it any further. And so when she started to go off the rails, as it were, no one really conceived of her as being dangerous. They didn't think she was capable of causing death and destruction. And unfortunately, she proved them wrong. And one of the things that haunts me about the case, after studying it in such depth, I think they ultimately came up with the right verdict at the end of her trial, not guilty by reason of insanity. And what haunts me is that I'm not sure if this case were to happen today, that we'd get it right today.
Wow, that's incredible. Tom, how about you? What do you want to talk about that we haven't discussed yet?
Well, I think we have to look at the fact that Cassie Chadwick was a woman before her time. We're talking about a period in American history here when women didn't have the right to vote, when they were regarded to be pretty much airheads as far as any kind of business or financial activity. And yet Cassie managed to master all of these things and at the same time turn it around and raise money, borrow money, become well known for her financial acumen that you just would not expect from a woman of her age, a woman of her time. So I think looking at reading the book, that it should be viewed also in the way that it looks at women and how women were treated and how women dealt with society in those days.
It sounds like she was a much more complicated person than people, before that we have given her credit for it. It sounds like that's kind of what you're driving at a little bit. She
was a very complex individual, and there was a great deal more to her than just being a simple, ordinary criminal. Now, we can't overlook the fact that she was a criminal and she did steal a lot of money and she did cause a lot of suffering, but she also did a lot of things that were extremely unusual for a woman of her age.
That's fascinating. Wendy, you get the last word. What do you wish we talked about? We haven't yet.
So with this book and with all my books, one of the things I try to do as a writer is capture like that human element. So whether they were a criminal or the victim, what brought this to those people, like what choices led here, in what circumstances at that time. It's so different now, like they couldn't text and ask for help or call 911. So I try to capitalize on that human element, what their circumstances were and what led to this event. So I want them to be everybody, the victims especially, but also the criminals, that they were real people and they made these decisions for a reason. So yeah, that's what I want people to remember about my writing.
That's terrific. Yeah, we're kind of at the very end. I haven't gotten the announcement on the screen yet, but it's getting towards 11. Thanks again to our panelists. This is a reminder that you can get copies of the books by each one of the authors from the Book Loft at German Village and at bookloft.com. And we'd like to thanks again to our festival sponsors and partners. And thank you for joining us. Please check out the Ohioana website for all this year's festival programming. We're just kicking it off right now. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.